Okay, we are going to get started again. Hope you can please make your way to your seats. Wow, it worked. Okay, we're going to have our first panel discussion right now, and we do have a moderator actually for all the panels that I want to introduce. Roger Berliner is an elected supervisor in Montgomery County, Maryland, was responsible for developing the PACE program in his county, and that effort actually led to LA County moving forward on our own PACE program. So Roger likes to take credit for the LA County PACE program happening here. He also is LA County's, my ex-energy counsel on federal energy matters and federal energy legislation, and my golf buddy too when we can make it out in DC or in LA. So Roger Berliner is very versed in PACE, very versed in federal energy policy, and I'm happy to introduce Roger as the moderator for all of the panels during this session. Oh, one last thing. I've done all of you a great favor too. Those of you who have come here to learn about PACE, you might see that I'm not on the first panel. I found a very good replacement, Dave Hodgins, who can really share PACE much better than me. So that's my gift to you.
And I am not one of his gifts to you, but I am grateful to be here, and thank you all for being here. Let me just briefly say something about what Mr. Blumenfeld observed, which is this conference is very, very important. For those of us that have been involved in the energy space and the energy efficiency world for 40 years, which I have been involved with, PACE was the most exciting breakthrough that any of us had imagined. This was going to be the vehicle by which we would achieve all the things that those of us who care deeply about our environment and our consumption of energy and our desire for clean and a healthy planet, we said, oh, this is going to be it, ladies and gentlemen. We can make this happen. And it started with a local government initiative, which is also so wonderful. And then we had some roadblocks. We had things like Mr. DeMarco at the Federal Housing Financing Authority that decided, well, maybe not so much on the residential side of the equation. Although, we will hear today, there are some brave souls who are going forward, notwithstanding those pronouncements. And I have great respect for people who go forward in that way. But this is important work, and what you've seen is a function, and part of what the Federal Housing Financing Authority has done is that literally 80% of our program before us is not on the residential side. It's on the commercial side, because that's where right now we don't face that kind of legal set of issues that we otherwise would face, and where the returns, of course, on a per unit of energy saved is quite extraordinary. So literally 4 of our 5 panels are dealing with those sort of sets of issues on the commercial PACE side, and we will turn tomorrow afternoon in our last panel to the future of the residential side. Mr. Blumenfeld made some observation about that one of the principal goals with respect to a successful PACE program is its simplicity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a lawyer and I'm a supervisor, and I got to say, I don't know if we've quite gotten there on the simplicity piece. And that's part of what we want to explore with you today, and tomorrow, my job and your job now really begins. Because while these people will make their presentations, it is really up to us to make sure that your questions are answered, and that the issues that we need as decision makers to truly understand, you do not leave here without understanding them. And there are a fair number of things, as Mr. Choi had observed, that we need to understand. It's not all that simple. We have 2 state laws, right? AB 811 and SB 555. We have 3 different models, a publicly funded model like Sonoma's, a JPA model of California First, and a standalone model that San Francisco and Placer have adopted. We have competing financing models, a single source versus open market. And all of that before you get to the issue of our mortgage banking industry relationship. I recently was in my state legislature arguing for a PACE kind of program, and I want you to know that there are very few industries that have more clout across the country than the mortgage banking industry, because anytime you can say that our industry has trillions of dollars, it does change the conversation. So working out this relationship with the mortgage banking industry is so critical. And there are those that have said we need to have lender consent, and there are those that have said, no, we can do this without lender consent. But whether we do it with lender consent or without lender consent, we really need to have relationship with this critical piece of the puzzle. And that's just what we're doing in the 2 panels this afternoon. All right? So we've got some work to do. And we're lucky to have a panel. Excuse me, I hope you heard me before that. We're lucky to have a panel before us today that will start that off. And we'll start with Siska DeVries, who, of course, is the person who conceived of this program to the benefit of all of us. And he'll give us a 15-minute overview. And then we'll have Dave Hodgkins, we will have Chris Lynch, and we will have Corey Downs of the city of Chula Vista share with us for 5 minutes each their perspectives with respect to where we stand in the commercial PACE realm. And then I will call upon you to be posing questions, and only if you fail will I try and step into the breach, but don't make me go there, okay? All right, Cisco, let's turn it to you.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks to Howard, everybody else who's been involved in getting this together and in leading the way. My job is sort of to set the stage to talk a little bit about how we got where we are and how we're going to go forward and what some of the key issues we have to discuss over the next couple of days so we all go home ready to go. I have been at this for over 6 years now, and I have spoken at a lot of conferences and events about PACE. You guys are my colleagues and friends and fellow travelers in that effort. It's an honor to be here. I particularly want to give a quick thanks to Chris Lynch, who's here, and Craig Hill in the back. Some years ago now, when I was working for the mayor of Berkeley and got noodling on this idea, and I wrote, as you do in government, a memo that maybe we could use this Mello-Roos thing that I'd been learning about for about 4 days to solve the nation's energy problems. I think most bond lawyers would have thrown me out of the room, and Chris and most financial advisors probably would have thrown me out twice. And Chris and Craig, not only we become friends, but I think in the end we'll have done something remarkable, as will all of you. So I wanted to start today by saying, going in the Wayback Machine, this starts way before me. This starts way back with a real founding father. This fellow here, you may recognize, is Ben Franklin. And Ben was known for many things, but the most important for us today was that Ben established the very first special assessment district back in 1736. And it was an opt-in district, and it was for fire services. If you paid, they'd put out the fire in your house, and if they didn't, it would burn. He's a very, very smart man, and we're indebted to him, and as I have said before, I would actually like to say that our proceedings here I know we elected a new pope today, but I would say that Ben Franklin is the patron saint of PACE, and I hope that he will look down fondly upon what we're doing, because over time, many people have used his example, what he started, this idea that people can get together and pay for improvements and solve pressing national and local priorities, that this is an important way to go about doing things as a society that governs itself. We can decide what is critical to get done and how we can use the infrastructure of government and taxation to do that. And over many, many years, that has been used. First, of course, fire services and building roads and building more roads, undergrounding utilities and putting in sewers, and even as we've now had more modern challenges, seismic strengthening and fire sprinklers and everything else. This is the tool that Ben Franklin invented that has got us here today. It is part of the reason we're all here and part of the reason that cities have come to be. And so all that really happened 6 years ago when Craig and Chris and I sat down to try and noodle through this was to take a very old, very well-known idea that you and me and local government had been using for generations and apply it to a fundamental problem that we needed to solve around energy. It didn't seem like at the time that was a particularly new idea. It got a lot of press and a lot of notoriety, and we'll talk about some of the issues we've run into. But I think it's important to start for a couple of minutes and just step back and say, this is not new. This is how leaders in local communities have been solving problems since long before we were walking the earth. And I think ultimately, why I have so much faith about what's going to happen in the future and how we're going to be successful, it comes back to that truth. This is not new. And if you read the state of California and Sonoma County and others' lawsuits and many of the 40,000 comments received by the FHFA in favor of PACE, many of them make that comment. Many of them make exactly that point. So let's get started. Jump ahead from the 1700s to 2008. We launched the program in Berkeley as a pilot to test it out. And in 9 minutes, the 40 homes that we had, the 40 slots we had for homes were taken with a waiting list many times over. And there are days, I will admit, that I have driven by this house. This is my old boss, Mayor Tom Bates, and Jean Pimentel, who was the second person in Berkeley to use PACE for financing her roof, as it was a solar system. And the reason that the event, this picture comes from the San Francisco Chronicle, was the first one was way up in the hills and hard to get to, so we had to have the media event on the second one. But I go by this house every now and then to remind me that that house is still standing. They look happy. Nothing's burned down. The value of their house has not collapsed. As far as I know, their mortgage is still in good standing. And all of that with clean generated power that she reports is saving her money every month. Of course, it was not just Berkeley. And that's what's so critical about this. About the same time, Palm Desert got started with its own program. And I have a photo here of Rick and Wendy Clark. Now, the reason I like to mention Berkeley and Palm Desert, and some of you have heard me say this before, is that if anything, this idea was more popular in Palm Desert than it was in Berkeley. People are saving money. They're jumping into this. There's hundreds that have made use of it. The climate in Palm Desert could not be more different than Berkeley. The energy costs could not be different. The politics, goodness, could not be more different. But it was a common sense solution that people said, this solves a problem that we have. We have a lot of folks with $1,500 a month utility bills in the summer. We need to do something about that, and here's a solution that helps them do that. So that idea, which I think started with the deep blue Berkeley and deep red Palm Desert, spread out around the country. I often say it went viral. It was red, it was blue states, it was purple states. And I think when Vermont and Oklahoma both passed PACE legislation in the same year, we realized something fundamental had taken root. This was not an ideological issue. This was common sense. This just empowered communities to see this as a problem that could be solved, that you did not need to wait for national action or some other thing. We could take it upon ourselves. And so that was powerful. And I think, even with the issues we've had with PACE, it's been wonderful to see how empowering it's been, that you give people a tool and they'll use it as best they can. And that has been exciting, that this is not just about one idea with PACE or one way of doing it, but how each state figures out how this helps solve fundamental problems around our nation's energy security, around climate, around jobs, and everybody's sort of moved along. And along that way, you built a PACE community. A group of people and leaders in local government and nonprofits and utilities and finance companies and many others who came together to figure out how to use PACE as a tool to solve a fundamental problem. Everybody in this room is a founding father or mother of PACE. This is a remarkable thing, and I can't tell you how exciting it is for me to be here and how to start off the beginning of this conversation. And I think we're here because it gave the ability for local communities to take ownership. And it spread quickly, more quickly than, as one guy in Congress told me. He said, "This is the fastest thing I have ever seen go from a policy idea to a national policy priority in my life." And he'd been there for 20 years. So we're here through all of the bumps along the road, I think, because it is so powerful, because it is not just one idea, because it is a tool that helps us solve many problems. But it is not helpful if we don't mention the bumps that have come along the road. We'll talk about some of them over the course, and again, my job is really to set the stage, to talk about how we got here and how we're going to succeed going forward. The Federal Housing Finance Agency is a relatively new agency. It was created out of a combination of some other agencies, and they quickly got to work looking for risk in the mortgage system while the mortgage system was imploding on itself. And I think partly we were simply unlucky. We wandered in with PACE at exactly the moment they were looking for things like this to step on. And if I were in their shoes, I'd be nervous about PACE too. The problem, as I always say, is that we couldn't figure out how to get them to take yes for an answer. We had what should be the best special tax assessment since Ben Franklin first wrote down it on the first piece of paper in 1736, where you make actual real improvements to people's homes that reduces their cost of living and improves the value of their houses. But they're not convinced of that, and as you are all related, I just wanted to put this up to remind us that what's out there. They have said in July of 2010 that not only is PACE contradictory to the mortgage contract we all sign when we get a mortgage, but that if people go forward, they can default you on that mortgage, require you to repay it. They can require larger down payments for all new mortgages issued in communities that offer PACE financing. And they can tighten the underwriting requirements for all communities that offer residential PACE, so that higher DTIs, debt to incomes, and other things are required. They haven't taken all of these steps, thankfully, and I think we'll hear from some who are pushing forward with this anyway. The state in Sonoma said, hey, we got to lift these restrictions as part of our lawsuit, and the judge said, no, these restrictions stay even as we go forward. So these rules are in place, and of course we all know the proposed rule they came out with last year in 2012 is pretty hostile to PACE. It requires they take immediate action to make first liens primary in the event a PACE goes on. But that's not the final rule. The final rule is in September. And there is a lot going on to try and bring some clarity and, I'd say, some sanity to this issue at FHFA. And we're going to keep working this. I'll be optimistic up until the moment. There's no reason to be optimistic, but I do think we have made as good of a case as a state as we possibly could and as a community of PACE folks. But of course, that left us with commercial, which is not a bad prize. This is a remarkable opportunity, and we've often thought perhaps the biggest opportunity, harder to crack at first, but much bigger by a volume of projects we can do. And as you heard from Jared Blumenfeld and by Roger and Howard, there are tremendous benefits that we have to reducing energy use in our commercial building stock. And PACE is like tailor-made to solve several of the fundamental barriers that have prevented us from going forward with commercial retrofits. It is uniquely capable, because of the long repayment terms and lower interest rates, to make cash projects deep retrofits, big improvements, to make them cash flow positive on the first day. It allows for the transfer between owners, which in commercial world is even more important than residential, as properties change hands quite a bit. And as we've seen in some projects recently, it actually allows, with the appropriate leasing, to pass through both the costs of the DePace lien and the benefits of reduced energy use to tenants when there's a split incentive. So we've got a great opportunity, a huge opportunity, and one that we're mostly here to talk about how we get started with. And how we take to scale. Of course, quietly and purposefully around the country, that's exactly what's been happening. I'm very proud that my company runs the largest PACE program in the country, CalFirst, as heard Jared mentioned. But that is just one of the, and it works with San Francisco and others, but these are just a few of the programs all across the country that are now starting to finance in Toledo, Ohio, in Florida, in Connecticut, all throughout the state of California, which is, as usual, leading the way. This is great. This is exactly what we should be doing, and I think what we're here today is how do we do this together? How do we do it better? How do we make this market faster? How do we get to scale and make sure we do it in a way where everybody can participate and win? Here in California, this is just a few of the emerging program models. We've taken different approaches. The reality is that there's a lot of similarities, probably 90% similar on all of them, and that's important for folks in the market to realize. But there are differences in how we've set up the programs and the type of financing, whether lender consent is required, what law we're using, as we'll talk about. All of those things, I think, are critical issues, and we don't have to agree on all of them. We're not going to agree on all of them, but I think making sure we agree and come forward with a uniform PACE community as best we can across the country, and then understanding where are the places where programs are going to differ is important, because right now there's confusion in the market. People they see a million different programs. They see all these different rules. I was talking to George today from Simon Property Group, and I think it's a big effort to try and understand how do we do this in Ann Arbor? How do we do this in Cleveland and in Los Angeles? We have not made a good case for how these things are so similar and how to make it easy for folks to work across jurisdictional boundaries, and we got to do that. We've got to do this. We've got to make it simple, even when we have some differences. And so that leads us to a set of questions that essentially are going to guide the conversation, I think, over the course of the next 2 days. In residential, whether you go forward or not. Do you wait for FHFA to complete its efforts? Do we go forward now as a community? Do you do it as a JPA? Do you do your own program? What kind of capital do you use, and where does it come from? How do you engage lenders with consent or acknowledgement or notice, and what are the best ways forward there? What legal framework? AB 811, which most programs are using, or SB 555, which is the genius work of Mr. Chris Lynch, but also what we used in Berkeley to start the program and what San Francisco uses. And also competition. How do you ensure that there's an open competition for financing, for projects, for contractors? Do you allow multiple programs to compete? How do you best do that in the context of your local community? All of these are really important. All of these are the subject of this panel and others. I just wanted to put them out because I think hopefully we all walk away, and this includes certainly me, with better understandings on all of them and a better way to go back to the communities we serve and do good. Jared mentioned, Rich is going to talk about, I just wanted to put up a picture because it's beautiful. Pier 1, this was the first project in San Francisco. We are getting success. We are getting projects done. Projects in the pipeline are in the millions and millions of dollars. Projects from small car wash owners to large multi-billion-dollar mall owners. This is happening all around the state and all around the country. We're getting big names and small. This is what's so exciting about this. When I got asked by a reporter recently, was the PACE going to actually happen? Is this for real? You know, I wish they could see this room, because this is what happens when something comes together and becomes a reality. I'm going to end here and look forward to the rest of the conversation. As I mentioned, I've been to a few of these conferences. Probably some of you have seen some of these slides before. Change is happening, and you guys are leading it. It is an honor to be here, to be part of this, to have played some role in getting us all together in the big picture, and to be part of a movement. And this is a movement. You guys, this is where we change the world. And this may be where we save the world. And thank you so much for keeping the faith on pace and keeping us going and making this such a success. I look forward to the rest of the time. Thank you.
You didn't know you were going to get motivational speaking here, did you? Thank you, Cisco. We will now hear from Chris Lynch, who will describe in part the differences, similarities between the two state laws that govern PACE in California. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Roger. Good afternoon. I like to start off my presentations with a little bit of humor, but my wife has assured me that bond lawyers never start off their conversations with humor, so I'm not going to. Cisco just listed a series of questions that we all have to address when we're undertaking PACE financings, and the one I was asked to address was AB 811, SB 555. In California, which law do you use and why, and specifically which one do I prefer, and I'm happy to talk about that. In the Placer program, Placer County program, which is represented here by Kimberly and Janine here today, in the California First program, and in a dormant Santa Barbara County program, I did work with AB 811, and in the Berkeley and San Francisco programs, I have worked with the Mello-Roos Act. Along with a number of other bond attorneys across California, we worked on drafting SB 555, in part because the Mello-Roos Act is what we all use whenever possible. Warren Diven, who is working, I think, on the WRCOG program, is here today, and I think what I'm going to say is in the mainstream of opinions and thoughts on these two laws, but Warren will throw something at me if it's not. So first, I think both of these laws work, and they work really well, and they get to the same place. They're both based on long-standing public finance tools. The 1911 Act in the case of AB 811, the Mello-Roos Act of 1982, Mello-Roos Community Facilities Act of 1982 in the case of SB 555. And they both have been used for financing privately owned improvements. PACE is not the first time anyone's done that. So PACE fits right within the general structure of what we already had in California law. Both allow a local agency to create a program or a district that is jurisdiction-wide. Both allow the financing of a broad swath of renewable energy, energy efficiency, and water efficiency improvements, and allow property owners that want to participate to opt in, and doesn't obligate property owners that don't want to participate. Both laws allow the tax or assessment that's levied to pay for the PACE improvements to transfer with the property upon sale. Stop changing the slides. Both allow both property-specific financings and pooled financings. For example, in the California First program, CSCDA, California Communities, is a statewide JPA, and it has formed 14 county programs. And it has authorized the issuance of bonds for each of those county programs. I'll call those program-level bonds. It has also authorized the issuance of revenue bonds that could be used to acquire those program-level bonds if there's an interest in establishing a statewide credit. So the California First program can accommodate a property-specific financing. It can accommodate a county-specific financing, so properties within just a single county, or it can accommodate a statewide or multi-county credit or pooled financing. And it can separate those properties, those pools into residential properties or non-residential properties, or a mixture of both. This flexibility is a feature of both of those laws and is not unique to one or the other, although California First operates under AB 811. Both secure the obligation to pay the special tax or assessment with a priority lien, and that's important to attract private capital. Both laws allow a local agency to agree to initiate accelerated judicial foreclosure in the event one or more installments are delinquent, and neither law requires that non-delinquent installments be accelerated, which is an important public policy issue and important in our conversations with the federal government and lenders. Both laws allow 100% off-balance sheet financings, and both allow the term of the financing to match up with the useful life of the financed improvements. So those are all very important key policy issues, things that we would describe as a must-have in PACE laws, and both our California laws have them available to them. But there are differences, and I wanted to mention a couple of those. And it's these differences in part that explain why I, given the choice, would choose to work on an SB 555 program. First, AB 811 raises constitutional issues, although validation, judicial validation, which most programs or all programs so far that do AB 811 have gone through. SB 555 does not raise those same constitutional issues, and judicial validation is not required by all bond attorneys, and it's my hunch that there will be a time when judicial validation wouldn't be required by any bond attorneys for an SB 555 program. AB 811 is not available to properties that are undergoing development. That's the term used in the law, properties undergoing development. While SB 555 has only one limitation, that is that any financing for a residential development that's under construction has to be for a project that's actually being constructed by the owner of the property. Both special taxes and assessments, as I mentioned, under those two laws have priority liens they're co-equal with the lien of the ad valorem taxes. So assessments, if you had both assessments, an ad valorem tax lien, and a Mello-Roos lien on a property, all three would be co-equal and would share priority. But as between assessments, the first in time assessment has priority over the second in time. So that's a relative disadvantage in my view of working with an AB 811 law. And the Mello-Roos Act is a really flexible financing tool. It's not as statutory as the 1911 Act is. So again, most public finance attorneys, given the choice, use the Mello-Roos Act on traditional public capital improvements. One example I would use is the Mello-Roos Act allows special taxes to be levied off the property tax roll, to be hand-billed. There's no clear authority to do that outside a variable rate indebtedness context under AB 811. At the end of 2012, as has been mentioned, San Francisco financed a series of improvements to be installed on Pier 1 for the Prologis headquarters. The bonds that were issued were Qualified Energy Conservation Bonds, or QECBs. These are taxable bonds, but the federal government agrees to pay direct credits to the issuer of the bonds, in this case San Francisco, as a subsidy to offset the debt service that's paid on those bonds. Unfortunately, these credits have been caught up in the sequestration process that we've all been living with. And so 8.7% of the subsidy that otherwise would have been payable to San Francisco will not be paid for the September 1, 2013 debt service payments unless the sequestration ends. And the fact that San Francisco is able to hand bill Prologis as the property owner paying the taxes, or as the taxpayer, means that they were able to increase the amount they otherwise would have billed to Prologis to account for the sequestration. Another advantage or flexibility that's in the Mello-Roos Act is actually Prologis is the leasehold, owns the leasehold on Pier 1. The building is actually owned by the city and county of San Francisco through its Port Authority. And the Mello-Roos Act allows you to levy special taxes on the leasehold interest as opposed to the fee interest. So here, if Prologis fails to pay its special taxes, what's foreclosed on is the leasehold interest and not the underlying fee that's owned by the city and county of San Francisco. So that's a nice piece of flexibility that's unique to the Mello-Roos Act. One final point I'd want to make is that under the assessment law, the amount of the lien securing the obligation to pay the assessments is actually equal to the principal amount of the assessment. So if you finance $20,000 or $20 million of improvements, the amount of the lien is that $20 million that's financed. Under the Mello-Roos Act, the amount of the lien it's a continuing lien, and it only secures the amount to be levied in any particular year. So at least optically, that's an important distinction. You have the situation where in both cases you finance $20 million, but the amount of the lien at any particular time could be drastically different. I think some think that may prove to have a significant or meaningful legal difference as you deal with the federal government. I personally don't, but anyway, it both optically and legally is a difference between the two laws. Just in sum, I think both laws work. There are differences. Given the choice, I would choose SB 555, but it didn't come until later. And all the programs that are using AB 811 have a perfectly useful law before them. But I think as local agencies think about starting a new program, they'll want to think about how to choose between those two laws, and some of the features that I described here are what you'd want to take into account. I think one of the questions that we all have to think about, and I would maybe leave this for future panels, is if you are a lender, PACE lender, and you're going to be buying bonds, A, do you care which underlying law is involved? And B, do you care that you only have to deal with one law? Is there some interest in the lending community in having a uniform set of laws that are consistent, A, in California, and B, outside California, across the nation, so that the investment community can have a clear understanding of what to expect from the law when they participate in this area? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now we'll hear from Dave Hotkins, is president and CEO of the Sustainto Group. Did I do that correctly? Neither? Okay. Other than that, I'm really doing a great job so far. I apologize. And he will speak, I think, this part I know, about the open market. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Roger said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the open market model. And as I think you heard from Cisco's introductory remarks and from Chris's remarks, it's early days. This is a little bit complex. There's a lot of ways to go, different models, combinations of models emerging and being combined in the markets. And so it's very exciting, but I think we are seeing across the board a huge uptick in activity. I can say that just in the last day, we got 3 new applications here in LA, just trying to sort it out. So it's amazing, the surge. I feel like 2013 is really the year. So with that, we'll leave some time for Q&A so people can get into pros and cons about single versus multiple, the different laws, as Chris was just talking about. Do we enter a JPA? Do we join California first? Do we try to do our own things? These are all questions that I think all of us are trying to balance, given different points in the process where we each are. So with the open market, I've been working on commercial PACE for a number of years now with Cisco and Chris and a bunch of folks in this room. And what I saw when I saw PACE was, as Cisco said, it's a tool. It solves a lot of market barriers. Frankly, market failures is what I would say, and I'm a markets guy. If energy efficiency is such a good thing, if it's such a job creator, if clean energy is such a good idea, why isn't it happening? And without belaboring those issues, it's because there are a number of issues relating to, specifically in the commercial space, credit of the owner, the short-term hold period of most investment real estate, and this issue where you've got non-owner user real estate, which is most of it, all the offices that most of us work in, retail, hotels, are all examples of that, industrial for the most part. They've made it really hard. So our philosophy here in LA, and the same program has been, the same model is being employed in California first, in San Francisco, and now state of Connecticut and around the country, is one where it's open market. PACE is a tool, let's give it to the market and let it solve those barriers and let the market sort out who's gonna be the winners and losers. In a market as large as California, as large as Los Angeles, we've got almost 2 billion square feet of commercial real estate here. So if you make some really conservative assumptions about market penetration, about investment on a per square foot basis, you get into the billions pretty fast. So there's room. And the market is also diverse. We've got, we're in downtown. This is where the largest concentration of our 1 million square foot plus skyscrapers are. Go to a different part of the city, it's small. It's strip retail, it's light industrial. It looks different depending where you go. So by allowing multiple capital providers to participate, you get a few different things. One is you get the guys who are only interested in the $1 million square foot, $1 million plus projects. Great. There's the middle market, which may be less interesting to certain investors, and there's the small stuff. Different investors, different contractors, different technologies apply in each of those sectors. So if we're trying to serve the broadest market segment, which I think every program is, that's important. Also in terms of credits, certain money requires certain underwriting. We can buy risky junk bonds. We can price those if we understand what the risk is. We can also invest in treasuries. We can price that, risk return. By allowing multiple investors to participate, we allow the market to decide what gets priced where, who's in, and as long as the county, in our case, or California First, their joint powers authority with CSCDA, San Francisco, elsewhere, is making sure that these projects are legal, that they're within the law, whether it's SB 555 or AB 811, and some basic provisions in line with the guidelines that DOE put out in response to FHFA's, kibosh on residential, that we're making sure that these are, basically good citizens who are putting these applications forward, working with the lenders to require consent, and we're putting the underwriting discipline where it should be, which is in the hands of the people who do this for a living, which are the bankers and the investors. It creates less work for the program as well, which translates into lower overhead and lower fees, all of which is good. And of course, as Cisco said, injects some competition as well. So I see some of our active PACE investors here in the room, and they're competing for some of these deals. And some they'll pass on. Say, you know what, give it to someone else. That one doesn't fit in my box. And that's fine, because we've got multiple capital providers, and some will get none. That's okay. So our goal, and I'm just going to try to be brief so we have time for questions, is as a program, is to facilitate introductions. I see some of our great, very active contractors in the audience here. I mentioned the PACE investors. We're helping them get to know each other, understand their client bases respectively, and then we start to see these relationships form in the marketplace where we've got certain investors who want the smaller stuff, and they're introducing them to contractors who work on smaller stuff. Certain guys only want the bigger stuff, and we're helping that to happen so that we don't have to be involved, so that the market takes over. We give the market a tool, the market uses the tool, and we get the lowest cost, best, most efficient product to the market that we can for our customers, which are our business owners. So thanks, and I'll take that as my time.
Thank you, Dave. Now we will hear, let's get this right, Corey Downs, City of Chula Vista, share with us why they've moved forward.
Thank you very much. And to start off, we currently have an RFP for residential and commercial PACE, open and active. So I'll be talking about our reasonings for releasing that and kind of the background behind that. So I'm from the City of Chula Vista. We're the second largest community in San Diego County. We like to think of ourselves as leaders in creating programs to help our residents reduce energy consumption, water consumption. And in that light, we, along with a lot of other local jurisdictions, were really excited when PACE first came on the market. We eagerly joined a JPA and thinking, as a lot of other jurisdictions did, that there'd be this wave of projects kind of sweeping over our community. And as that chilled with FHFA's decision, we started to, we were really put in kind of a waiting pattern, just waiting to see where FHFA would go, and kind of waiting for this projects to happen. At the same time as we were waiting, we saw other jurisdictions create programs, and especially residential programs, which is one of the focus that we have, as that's where the majority of our energy consumption is. So as we saw other jurisdictions create programs, we started to wonder if there was more that we could do other than just wait for further action. At the same time, there was some pressure from above at our local, or at our city leadership to create a PACE program. So we had leaders wanting a PACE program, city staff wanting a PACE program, but we were still just left there kind of waiting for someone else to take action. And so to overcome that barrier, what we did was create an RFP, which allowed us to do a few key things. The first is lay out what we thought the most ideal PACE program would be for us here in Chula Vista. And that has to deal with has a lot of the same components as the PACE programs throughout the state, but also focusing on local economic development, as well as leveraging our existing programs that we are already creating or already engaging our community with to make the PACE program as successful as possible. It also allows us to equally get all the details and a lot of details from the PACE providers about what they intend or what their program will do in our community. And that's really great, especially because then we can provide those details to our city attorneys so that they can feel comfortable with going forward with whatever type of program that we eventually go forward with. So that RFP was released last month, and we're currently in that process. So unfortunately, I won't be able to mention or talk about much more about that. But hopefully, in the future, you'll see more information, and hopefully a Chula Vista PACE program that will allow us to kind of capitalize on some of these great advantages we've been talking about. And that's nice and brief.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn now. Need some questions from you. All right, what did you hear that perked you that you feel like you need a little more clarification with respect to? Yes, sir. All right, why don't I? There you go. That's the kind of participation we need. I'll tell you what, why don't I try and repeat the essence of the question until we figure that piece out. But basically, the question was interest rates. Why are they where they are? Can't they be lower given the low-cost nature of it? Interest rates appear to be a barrier to participation. Is that a fair characterization? Who are you? And what's your social security number and your Dun and Bradstreet rating and, you know.
Thank you. It seems intuitive that a program like this with such low risk ought to offer more or less the least expensive money that you could expect to leverage on a program like this, right? And yet, the rates that we have heard quoted seem to be higher even than some would expect on their first lien mortgage. And by the way, who am I? My name is Desmond Wheatley, and I'm the president and CEO of Envision Solar, a San Diego-based provider of solar products.
We now have the question. Gentlemen, do we have an answer? Who cares to offer?
I'll take a swing at that. Is this on? There we go. Hold it. So as we've been talking about, PACE is pretty new, and you're correct. You're absolutely correct that given the security of the repayment mechanism, it should be low, and it will be lower. We've got some of our PACE investors in the room whom I'd welcome to jump in or correct me if I say anything inaccurate. But for now, what we have is a long-term fixed-rate bond, and you got one of them per project, if you're talking about the way that most programs are set up. So it's hard to sell that. It's kind of like these guys that stole all the diamonds in Antwerp a couple weeks ago. What do you do with all of these diamonds? When you have, and we're in a very low interest rate environment, and we're in a very low interest rate environment. This is 20-year paper, a lot of it. So rates are certainly going to go up. Who knows where we'll be 20 years from now as a country or as a city. So for now, we've got a fairly illiquid, long-term instrument. But I think the strategy that most PACE investors have is not to hold these things to maturity, but to package them across programs and across geographies, and even outside the state. As long as we've got the senior lien, you could do that. Package them and sell them. The capital markets work in huge chunks of money, much larger than what each individual project is looking at. But once that liquidity comes into the market, I think we'll see rates come down a lot. That said, in the near term, at least in an open market program, the rates are negotiable. There may be a floor in the near term, but the rates are negotiable. We can compete these projects across PACE investors potentially, or at least get more than one look at it. And each project is different. Some will require a lot more work. Not every property has a mortgage, let's say. That could be a lot of work to get the existing lender on board, or may not be. So it's higher than where it should be, agreed, but I think in the near to middle term, we'll see it come down significantly. Did I say anything wrong, Derek? Okay. I just repeat what Derek says now.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am. And And we do, and thanks to the suggestion from the floor, we do have mics.
Hi, I'm Susan Mundus from the City of Santa Monica. I have a question about how the lenders determine which projects are financeable. In other words, do you have to present an ASHRAE Level 2 audit in order to be financed, or is it simply taken on the property owner's word that there's, I mean, is there some sort of industry standard that would make these projects much more financeable and thereby reduce interest rates?
Hi, Susan. I'll take the first crack. I think there are two things that happen, generally speaking, on these programs, and sometimes those are connected into a single process. But first is that there's the programmatic kind of underwriting. So if you're Cal First or San Francisco or LA, there's a set of requirements that the city or the governing body has set to make sure that all of the projects are actually providing a benefit as required by the law, right? And so those things are in place, and they're going to do a set of things around the property and the project and what's happening and checking and quality assurance on several things. And then the investor, if sometimes the investor is the same as the program, but in many cases, we've talked about the open market, the investor will be different. And sometimes those investors will often have some additional requirements. But generally, you have those two levels. The investor, in many cases, is not the one checking all of that. Some of that's being done by the program. Sometimes it's being repeated. But you have both of those things happening. And then the investor will be looking at certain other elements that may be less important to the program. And investors have some different criteria around this. That's part of what I think Dave does and my team does is try and identify the best source of capital for each project based on where that project is. But also do a lot of the quality assurance and make sure that projects are what they say they are. I do think as we get going that we will increasingly need to see and want to see more cookie cutter approaches. It won't be universal on commercial. It's too big. Hotels and car washes are too different. But what you'll see is very specific standards start to emerge within segments. This is what works for Class A office. This is what works for hotels or for whatever else. So I do think that does need to happen. We're starting to see the beginnings of it. But unfortunately, unless somebody has a better idea, the best way that we've seen is you just got to get some projects going and done, and then that creates the model. So unless Dave, you have more to add, or others, that's my sense of how this is going and where it needs to go.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on what Cisco said, LA is actively working with California First and San Francisco to move towards more uniformity in terms of our programmatic underwriting criteria. So if I'm a property owner, and I've got properties in each of those markets, that I don't have to relearn the program. So that's one thing. You asked about the energy audits, and that's been a question that's come up a lot, and people say, oh, we'll do an ASHRAE Level 2. An ASHRAE Level 2 audit is actually not very well prescribed. It's a general methodology, but in terms of what that actually looks like and what the report looks like and how it's presented and what assumptions are stated and what is not, that is not in there. So the Environmental Defense Fund has organized a great group, and it's called the Investor Confidence Project. And they're really trying to pull from existing standards, looking at ASHRAE, ASTM, which is the standard-setting body that came up with the environmental phase 1, when we were like, now we're saying, what do we do with PACE? Before it was, what do we do with brownfields? And how do we have a standard report? So that work is being done, and I think it's something that is beholden on us as PACE program managers to follow and understand, because that's going to help in the consent process. That's going to help working with existing lenders, and also, for that matter, with the PACE investors. And I think, to Desmond's question, will eventually help bring down interest rates and transaction costs as people get used to this, but it's still new. It's the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, and it's called the Investor Confidence Project. It's a great group of people involved in that.
We have a question in the back next to Mr. Choi.
Is it on?
It's on.
Okay, would you please elaborate more on the lender consent required? And then tell me also the advantages or disadvantages of the programs that does require lenders and the one that doesn't require lender consent. Thank you.
So we're just talking about commercial right now. Residential is a different kettle of fish. And I think all but one program in the state of California currently requires what is often referred to as lender consent, although the word consent often isn't used anymore. Really what it is you need the acknowledgement of an existing lender in some form as part of the final application that says they will not exercise the default provisions of their contract, that they understand what's happening and it's not defaulting the mortgage. This is from what we've, everything we've heard and talking to, this is pretty standard practice. When you do a solar PPA lease, you get a subordination non-attornment agreement, which requires the lender, existing lender, to sign about what happens in the event of default and who gets what cash flows. So this is a fairly common process. I think often we've gotten some terminology issues around, but what the programs have said, this will be a broader conversation I think shortly, is, so I won't dive too far into it, is this is a relationship between the lender and their property owner, but the local government does not want to get in the middle and have caused a default and get drawn into that. Let's make sure that they've worked that out and show us that they have. But I think we'll talk more about how that's going to work in the next panel, so I should probably call it quits there.
Yes, as Cisco observed, our next panel is about that very issue, among others, in terms of the mortgage lending industry and relationships. So if we could just put a pause on that until we hear from those experts, I think we'd be better served. Next question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Genevieve Sherman. I'm the manager of the Commercial PACE program in Connecticut. So I'm happy to be in LA where the sun is shining. My question is about AB 811 and SB 555 and language concerning off-balance sheet financing. Could you speak a little bit more as to what in the language explicitly or implicitly allows off-balance sheet financing to happen, and whether there's been any pushback on that in any of the programs in California from what you guys have seen?
Sure. It is implicit in the way those two laws work. The tax or assessment levied to pay a PACE financing, just as a tax or assessment paid by a property owner to finance a public capital improvement, it's an obligation of the property. It's not an obligation of the property owner. So if a property owner walks away from the property and refuses to pay special taxes or assessment, the only remedy available to the local agency who levies that tax or assessment is to foreclose on the property. There's no right to go after the property owner to collect the amounts that have been billed to the property. So it's off balance sheet in the sense it's not a personal obligation of the property owner, it is an obligation of the property.
Did that answer your question?
There is a debate about, in the accounting standards, how this will be accounted, which is sort of different. I totally agree with Chris on the legal front, but what you need to do for your books when you account for this is a different story.
Maybe we can discuss that after. That really was my question, is the accounting treatment from an owner and their accountant's perspective. Thank you.
Undetermined at this time.
Question.
LaRock from Sonoma County, and I have a question for Dave Hodgkins. And we are trying to build our finance availability. And so first question is, do you have one program and multiple investors, or do you have multiple programs that you're running?
They put me back on. Thought they cut me off. We have one program with multiple investors, but I'll caveat that by saying is we've got programmatic underwriting criteria, and that's where we're looking to harmonize with yourselves and with the other California programs. But then each investor will have their own specific underwriting criteria, and so what we did and what Connecticut did was we issued a request for information, essentially, to all the potential investors that we knew. And that was really only scratching the surface. There are many others out there, and we're going to do another one. See who else wants to get into this space now that we've got it built. And we asked them, what are your specific underwriting criteria to look at a project? What size and types of projects are you interested in seeing? Are you going to ask, and they're free to ask for, require things above and beyond what the program may require. So that's between the parties, though. And so that's where the market comes in and says, okay, well, this guy's really, really conservative, but he's giving me a better interest rate because I'm a great credit. These guys are willing to take a riskier project. Their underwriting is looser. It meets the programmatic floor, but that'll go to another guy. So in a sense, we've got a program that's making sure everything is legal in the basic sense, and then we've got investors, each with their own criteria that lets them serve a broader or more narrow, sliver of the market.
And then how does the financing actually happen? Do you issue bonds for each project, or what do you do?
That's correct. Yeah, that is the model, bonds for each project, and we are doing our very, very best to absorb as much of the cost as we can in these early days, and we're fortunate to have some budget for that, and that this becomes efficient and a standard kind of process every month that the tax collector will go through as we get more volume.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I guess I'm hearing about the lender approval of the financing and the mortgage lender approval, and that the bond community is requiring that we have a priority lien in order to move forward. It sounds like because they want to aggregate across state lines, and there seems to be an apparent potential conflict there. And I'm wondering where that requirement is really based in these two laws, if it is, or is it coming from the lenders? And is there any flexibility in whether these have to be priority liens or not?
Again, if I could, it's an important question, and it's why we have a whole panel devoted to helping you understand that dynamic, and that will be coming up after these guys. So if you could hold that question until they've presented, hopefully they have answered that question. If not, that'll be the time and the people to whom to address that question. We're back.
If they haven't answered, it's been a giant waste of time.
Thanks for allowing me to. Is the later panel going to
It's
deal
only
with...
because the D&B rating, it was
You feel
okay.
sorry for
It was
me?
a-
Is the later panel going to deal with term too? Because if it isn't, I think I heard you mention that term can be tied to the useful life of the improvement. And if that is the case, who is making the assessment of what the useful life of the improvement is?
Generally speaking, the term is determined. You can't finance something beyond its useful life because there has to be, the reason you're charging the assessment is an improvement is providing a public benefit. And once that benefit stops, obviously you have a little bit of an issue. And Chris can speak more about how that works. Programmatically, look, I mean, what we've done is, I think we've all worked with engineering firms who specialize in energy engineering and who we've developed then a list of projects and measures and the useful life associated with each one. But then as projects come in, we check against it. When there are things we don't know, we go back to the applicant and to our engineering firm and we work through it. So we haven't had a huge issue with disagreement about this yet. I'm sure that there will be some over time, but solar often easily gets to the 20 years because the warranties will get you there. Other things are more 10 years, and so we've worked out in projects where the actual financing will actually will change over time. So you'll have things that will come out after the first 10 years, they'll be paid off, but other things that last longer. We've had to develop that as part of the programmatic approach to financing these things so we don't run afoul of having people paying assessments for projects that are no longer providing a benefit.
Yeah, and just to put a slightly finer point on it, Cisco's firm hired a great engineering company out of the Bay Area and they look to ASHRAE standards. ASHRAE does publish standards on the useful life of certain types of lighting, certain components of an HVAC system, et cetera. That starts to bump up against warranted life as technology advances. I know your technology is much longer lived than even certain other solar technologies. Some LEDs now have 10+ year warranties on them, whereas ASHRAE is going to tell you it's 7 or 8 years. So there are those contradictions, but we're trying to point to published standards for the purpose of setting the term of the PACE financing. But if you're looking at a big mechanical project, solar project, for example, I mean, we can say it's 20 years. The maximum term, which I think may have been where your question was headed, is set programmatically. So I think that hopefully I don't say anything wrong, but if we see that a warranty, a hard warranty is going to go out longer than 20 years, I think we could discuss it. that is a programmatic decision. The minimum is really set by the useful life. To Cisco's point, there has to be a benefit. If we can prove with money that there's going to be a benefit, then we can talk about it.
In the back.
Thank you. John Kramer from Sundial Solar. I've heard a lot about interest rates, and that is a concern of mine, obviously. It's pretty high interest that I've been quoted. I do have a question, though, concerning one-time fees. You know, interest rates are one thing, but what are the fees associated with getting set up in a PACE program for a project? And are those fees scalable according to the project? Because obviously it impacts a smaller project more if the fees are just fixed. Thank you. Oh, by the way, I would like to tell you that I'm very impressed. I've been doing a lot of research in PACE for over a year now. I have offices in Monterey, and I also have office in Minneapolis. We do a lot of work in Minnesota. It's got quite an exciting solar market. However, PACE really hasn't gotten off the ground in Minnesota. It's run into some stumbling blocks. But hopefully those will be overcome. I want to congratulate the state of California and you people for moving this forward. It's a very sensible thing. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm just blushing. No, I mean, we can all answer parts of this. I'll say it's programmatic, right? So different programs have different fee structures. Some charge fees to contractors directly for projects, some do not. Many that we work on, all the ones we work on scale the fees related to project size. We understand that smaller projects are a little more expensive to get done, but you can't, you know, you reduce the percentage fees associated with things, and you put that together as part of an APR when you're looking at project costs. A lot of the project costs in the early days in San Francisco and LA and others are being covered by grant and other money to try and make sure that we can keep the fees to as low a number as possible, or sometimes zero. So it does vary somewhat between the programs, and I think it's incumbent on the programs to be very transparent about the fees, but also to then work to make sure that the it's appropriate. There's also some work around whether having differential fees based on how much work goes into the project. Sometimes projects come in completely ready to go, financing, all that's fine, and it's pretty easy from that point on to get it done. Some require a lot of hand-holding. Over time, programs are going to have to find a way to accomplish fees that are differential based on the amount of work that goes into each project, in my opinion. But that hasn't been implemented yet. So unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. But it does vary by project size, and it is by program, set by each program. I don't know if you guys have any better stuff. That's it. All right.
Yes, sir.
Dan Thatcher with ACO Engineered Systems. Dave, I'm encouraged by what you say about lenders and leveraging and competition. Because one of the things we found early on is that when we would talk to somebody about PACE, who was going to provide financing, it was basically limited to somebody who fully owned their property, or their leverage was so low that probably they could afford to buy the project out itself, and yet it seemed kind of contradictory that at the same time we were looking for projects that needed funding. So we're limiting ourselves to people who don't need the funding. So the first question to you is, are you seeing with the discussions that you're having in the open market that not only the rates are coming down, but some of the rather conservative requirements that lenders were having are becoming a bit more making this program a bit more accessible than what at least I saw in the early stages?
I think the next panel may touch on that a little bit. I'll say that, you know, for now, banks generally don't really understand energy efficiency or distributed generation. And so they're looking at these projects the same way they look at any other loan. Can the building, with its current cash flow, support this additional indebtedness, which we all know this is not debt, this is different. That said, I think, even for those people, and it's an educational process, I think, on all sides, for companies, Simon Properties is in the room. They've got ready access to capital and to the capital markets at very affordable rates, but some of the features of PACE are more important than the interest rate. And that's the long-term nature, the transferability, the ability to share the cost with tenants, all these things. So not everybody gets it right away. Not everybody has that aha moment, but we're seeing a lot more of it. I mean, I don't know what's in the water in 2013, but we're getting a lot more people that are getting it all of a sudden en masse. So banks are coming along. I think Natalie from PACE Now will probably talk about progress that we're making with some of the really large banks, with Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase, here locally with East West Bank, and a number of others. They're starting to get it. So we're learning as we go how to work within their box and put forth projects and correct misperceptions that they may have about what this is and the benefits of it.
Quick question, if I could. So I'm a project developer. How do I go about navigating these waters to determine what funders match my projects? Is that a function you guys are going to take on, or am I left to my own devices?
Well, it's kind of both. I mean, as I said in my remarks, we want to facilitate introductions for ACO, for your peers, to investors who want to invest in the types of projects with the types of clients that you work with. To the extent that a client wants to see multiple options, I or one from my team, we've got the rest of our project development team here as well today, are available to facilitate that process. We want to move towards a more kind of web-based, automated system. And speaking to the gentleman's point about fees, that would be the ideal, and we're kind of becoming more and more streamlined as we go here. But for now, just call me.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just briefly say that's the same. I mean, there's a lot of hand-holding goes on, and that's what our jobs are now, right, is to help this through, because it gets easier over time. I mean, Sonoma certainly had that experience as they got started. Is at first it's a lot of hand-holding, and then contractors start coming in and they know the drill, and it's pretty fast, and I'm sure they can talk about that. The second thing I would mention is if you go back in time to solar PPAs and commercial, there was many years of slogging through this with existing property owners and banks and others, to lenders, to get approvals and find capital. And I hope we can be faster than the 8 to 10 years it took for them to get to some scale. I'm optimistic we will, but I just think it's also part of financing in the commercial sector is it's a complex ecosystem, and we're all doing the best we can to kind of work in each piece of this and find the way through, so that you then have done this a couple times and it becomes relatively easy and you can go do lots of it, and it's a lot easier for us then too.
Corey, let me ask you one if I could, because one of the fundamental questions that people were grappling with is that we have these three different models, as you appreciate, with respect to going forward. You have the JPA model, you have the standalone model, and you put out an RFP. Tell us why you chose that particular approach as opposed to the other models that were available to you.
Yeah, so we chose to release the RFP, like I said, because that really allows us to have everyone put all the cards on the table and provide us the programmatic details that will underlay the program. And that allows our decision makers, our city attorneys, to evaluate everything and compare it at the same time, kind of in an objective way. So that really lets us, be equal to all the PACE providers, and at the same time prioritize what we feel will make the program as successful as possible in our community through that RFP process and the process of reaching out to the PACE providers. Good at the.
Cisco, did you want to speak to, or anyone else speak to, the benefits of the other models, so that people can really walk away from here having a clear path forward that works for them?
Yeah, one of my questions was, it's expensive to start up a PACE program. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of people that need to be involved. How is the city paying for, has it made a commitment of city funds to pay for that, or what is its financial approach to
Our program is, or at least as was laid out in the RFP, is a at no cost to the city program. So all those program costs are kind of included in the program. And that, really allows us to, or it's kind of a requirement for cities where we're very limited on funds. And so, that allows us to get around some of those limitations.
Mr. Lynch, you had posed a question that I don't believe you answered, but you seemed to invite the question as to whether or not the state would be better served by having one law as opposed to two laws. Do you want to opine with respect to that?
Well, luckily, I don't have to answer that because that ship has sailed.
But now we could have a third law to bring the two laws together. So.
Yeah, I think the point I tried to make in my presentation was that these laws are very similar on in many fundamental ways, and so I wouldn't expect that the difference between the two laws or the existence of the two laws would prove to be a barrier to financing. In fact, just in the normal public finance context, we often do financings where a single bond is sold and it's payable from assessments on the one hand and Melrose special taxes on the other, and the minor differences between those two laws can be accommodated. I think it would be clear. I think it would be clear to have one law nationally. Absent that, I think we need to focus both nationally and within the state on making sure that the fundamental principles that we've been talking about, the lien priority, whatever that may be, the foreclosure process, whatever that may be, all those things are standard, and so lenders can expect to see some uniformity on the key credit principles. And I actually think for the most part we have that in California.
Let me do my own follow-up, if I could. As a leader of a community that sponsored a home energy loan program, a residential PACE program, I am now, with Connecticut as my lead, looking at having a commercial PACE law, if you will. Do you recommend different laws for residential versus commercial, or can you accommodate both?
It seems to me a single law can accommodate both, in my opinion. I think, again, the fundamental principles are the same. You might have, I think really it's at the programmatic level that you would draw distinctions between residential and non-residential.
I think we have a question from the audience still.
Kevin Smith, I'm with the Economic Development Corporation serving Fresno County. I'm kind of digging back here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you're able to, at least with the California First program, finance maybe the cost of like an audit or, those attenuating costs that come with doing the project. And if so, I guess my question then is, how do you determine where that line is as to what is an attenuating cost that goes with the project? I mean, there's engineering and permits and things like that. And if so, is there a difference, I guess, between 811 and 555 in terms of what can be, or is it just programmatic, up to your own? And if it is programmatic, where are your lines in particular?
Generally, the associated costs with the project can be financed. And there are some programmatic distinctions about how that gets done that vary a little bit, but for the most part, the programs are the same. So the audits and other things that go into the project can be, and including there are improvements that often get made as a project that themselves aren't energy reducing, but are required to control the energy reducing things and to go along with those. So there's a good deal of flexibility. And again, we've created kind of a list of measures and things that can be financed, and when we go beyond that, we work with the engineers who do, every day, and our program staff who do this. So we've gone through this pretty well and looked at all of the pieces, and most of the stuff can be sort of rolled into the financing when you get done. I don't believe there's much of a distinction between the two laws on those, but I would defer to Chris as long as I've answered the first part of the question.
I don't think there's a meaningful difference between the two laws. In public finance, where often our decisions are driven by federal tax law, we're used to asking whether particular costs are chargeable to the capital account for a project. And from my point of view, that's a good rule to follow here as well. If the costs that we're being asked about whether it can be financed would be chargeable to the capital account for that improvement as an accounting matter, then it probably is going to fall within the public policy of being financeable. And if it doesn't, then that's probably a good sign that it probably shouldn't be.
And in terms of what percentage of the overall project cost, I think we've in LA, and I don't think in any other programs, have put a programmatic, it's 10%, it's 25%. Because when you do that, without having a lot of data to work with or the project specifics, you could exclude some projects that maybe required more labor or more design as a proportion of the installed cost that are maybe good projects. So, if we start to see really wacky things and people building in, huge amounts of labor and engineering, ultimately those projects won't pencil, right? Because the energy savings resultant from that project will not be enough to make it rational for the property owner to want to do it in the first place. And certainly their bank's not going to agree to it. So in a sense, the market will correct for that at the end of the day. So what we've tried to do is just be as hands-off as we can. And if we need to get stricter down the road, we will. But the market will take care of that just because that's what it does.
Question from the side.
Let's see, Derek Brown, Clean Fund. This actually goes back to a question you had posed earlier, residential and commercial PACE. Back in the early days, PACE was all about residential, and commercial was kind of an afterthought that was getting dragged along. When residential kind of got shelved for a while, then we started going forward on the commercial side. And given the brain trust up there, what I'd love to hear a discussion of is for communities that are looking to go forward with PACE, how do they view residential versus commercial? And what are some of the decision parameters? Can you go forward with one without doing the other currently and then add it in later? If the underlying legislation can be the same for both, then what do you do from a program standpoint as well as community buy-in?
Well, I think there's a fairly simple answer from my perspective to this, Derek, which is the law authorizes residential and commercial. So when you set up the program, there's no reason not to set up a program that does both. I think the issue that's come up in Connecticut and some other states is passing the law that today that includes residential is sometimes problematic, right? You run into resistance because people are worried about it because of the FHFA issue. So they just pass a commercial law to avoid getting into that debate. It's a perfectly rational political response to get something done and not. But here in California, we don't have the issue. The laws allow both. So California First, San Francisco, LA, all the authorizations, legal validation, everything we've done includes residential. You can turn residential on in all of the programs we work on, overnight. The issue is is a policy decision, and I think this is probably the best way to do it is to have residential in your back pocket, or if you want to go forward with residential, that's the subject of a different debate and a different discussion in a panel tomorrow. But I'm just saying at the very least today, keep residential in your back pocket. It absolutely can be turned on soon, at some point, hopefully, if we get FHFA clearance. And if not, then you don't turn it on. So California First is the CSCDA board said it's all completely authorized and ready to go, but we will not accept, as a matter of policy, applications for residential until we have clearance and give approval at the board level for this. So we're just working through it. And I think others are making slightly different determinations, but I would say I don't have any particular reason why you wouldn't go ahead and set everything up and then just decide whether you want to launch residential or not. I have my opinion about that, and others are going to talk about theirs, but that's where I would leave it.
And let me just add, as an elected official representing 1 million people back home, who sponsored our residential PACE program, we've made the judgment that we cannot move forward at this juncture given the threat posed by FHFA and foreclosures and so I look forward to the conversation tomorrow of those who are going forward, because I couldn't say to my citizens, you should run this risk. I just can't say that. So our effort going forward is certainly going to be on the commercial side and looking at our law that we passed to see whether or not it needs to be tweaked in order to accommodate the commercial side, and probably making it explicit in that context that we probably will choose to go for lender consent just by virtue of the nature of the relationships between the commercial parties are such that I feel it's a little different than on the residential side. But again, we'll have that conversation too, because there are proponents that say even in the commercial space, you don't need lender consent. But politically, that is such a hot button issue that I feel like if I can take that off the table, I have a path forward that I would not otherwise have. Let me turn to a wrap-up question for our panelists because, particularly in the commercial space, this is so new. And I think, Cisco, you articulated very well, the commercial finance world is its own, what was the word you, almost its own? Ecosystem. So if our panelists could share with us their thoughts on the most important challenges, barriers, hurdles to overcome in order to make the commercial PACE program grow to the level that we all aspire for it to become. What is it that in your experience to date you say to yourself, if I could fix 2 or 3 things, if I can get these pieces down, I can make this pop?
Sure. I mean, we're all here because we want to see more clean energy, because we want to see more energy saved while we figure out what's going to be the next, magic source of energy that's going to let us live another 1,000 years. Most people do not care. I hate to say it, but they don't. And for most businesses, unless it's a very energy intense, manufacturing business or a data center, energy is, maybe number 10 in their concerns to get through in the day, and they only get to number 6, each day. So it's not necessarily a priority. If I'm just use an example, if we're in a beautiful hotel, their top priority is going to be guest experience, then guest experience, and then guest experience again, and maybe down here it's energy. But if we can start to draw the connections between energy performance and guest experience, and the comfort in the room, that they have quieter fans, better lighting, same kind of analogies hold true in office or retail environment. It's been shown that in retail environments with more natural light, better ventilation, people buy more stuff. That's what people care about, is the buying more stuff part. Saving energy is nice, and if it's an overall cost benefit, that's nice. But what our challenge has been, and we're getting much better at it, is drawing those connections, I think, to the top line drivers that are really motivating small businesses and large businesses to make any kind of investment.
Cisco, go ahead, Corey.
So I guess from a local government perspective, one of the key barriers is just the ability of the property owners to know that these programs exist and to work with the local contractors that are doing these projects to increase the visibility and the familiarity with the programs, so that they're going to be the salespeople for the programs, and so that they, as they're doing their projects, they use this as an option. And the more local presence and more visibility that the program has, the better chances that that building owner is going to be aware of this and utilize that option.
I totally, I agree with both of these things. I just want to build off of Dave for a second, and obviously Dave and I talk about this often over beer, so people have to want, PACE has to solve a problem. PACE solves a fundamental problem in the marketplace or an upfront cost, and it helps solve a fundamental public policy problem around energy and clean energy and greenhouse gas emissions and all the other things people have decided to use it for. But it has to solve a problem for the consumer, for the building owner. And we got to meet people where they are. And I just agree that people today are not in a place where they're saying, I'd like to buy some energy efficiency today. So I'd like them to be in that place, but I can't wish it. So I'd like to instead find how we can make sure that PACE and energy efficiency is solving a problem they do have, a broken HVAC, whatever other issues. Sometimes it's high energy cost, sometimes it's asthma in residents. I don't think there's an incandescent, I don't think there's a single CFL in this room, right? They're not going to change that just because I think that would be a good idea, whether you have PACE or not. Not that PACE can finance bulbs, but. My point is that we have to solve a problem, and I think we have to get better as a community at making sure that what we are selling, PACE, energy efficiency, is solving the problem the customer has at scale around the market. And until we do that, PACE isn't going to take off, because PACE itself, people don't finance things for fun. They finance things because they need to finance something they need to get done. This is a great tool for financing. We got to make sure we can sell the product. So I think we sometimes get ahead of ourselves on the policy and haven't solved the consumer experience yet. And I think Dave's right and everything's right. We got to get out there on that, but it's about solving that. It's about solving that problem, and that's the single most important thing. PACE is a great solution once somebody knows they want to buy it.
Did you want to?
Sure, yeah, the only thing I would add is it seems to me the one thing we all need to figure out a way to solve is the relationship between PACE and existing lenders. And it would be great to figure out a way to do that at something other than the project-specific level. If we could have, I know for Sonoma County, for example, they worked, I understand, with lenders within their community to develop some kind of blanket approach to properties that were encumbered with loans from those entities. It would be great to even take it up to a higher level so that we eliminate what the relationship is between PACE and existing lenders from public policy issues. You don't have to worry about what you're inviting your property owners into. You don't have to worry about differing interpretations by lawyers as to what particular words in a contract might mean. It's just we have a clarity on what we can do and what the standards are for that. And that would be fantastic, I think.
And I think it's a wonderful segue into our next panel. So let's first thank this panel.